Hello, I'm Eric Landrum from the Psych Sessions Network and also a Season 3 co host of Teaching Matters, along with co host Dr. Rob McIntarfer from Lincoln Public Schools in Lincoln, Nebraska. We're pleased to bring you this collection of 10 episodes recorded from September 2021 through April 2022. Two episodes in Season 3 featured guests. In Episode 4, we speak with Casey Swanson from Plymouth High School in Canton, Michigan. And in Episode 10, we speak with Ginger Wickline from Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Georgia. As usual, a wide range of topics are discussed across these 10 episodes. Here is just a sample: research methods, student mental health, hypothesis testing, fictions teachers tell themselves, self-care tips, assessment chat, rubrics, AP psychology, IB psychology, high school teachers making connections with college teachers, understanding graphs, accreditation, rather than doing more, purposely doing less, the subjectivity of grading, study skills advice, modality switching during the semester, adapting to natural disasters in one's life, using storytelling purposely as a teaching strategy, the professional demeanor at conferences, improv for teachers, why oh why extra credit, STP's This Is How I Teach blog, hearing the diverse voices of teachers of psychology, and so much more. Please enjoy Season 3 of Teaching Matters from Psych Sessions. Well, hello there, Dr. Rob,
Hello, Dr. Landrum.
and welcome to Season 3 of Teaching Matters. If you're a regular listener, thank you for listening along. And hopefully, you've just finished listening to Season 2, which we released sometime in September of 2021.
Yay. I'm amazed that you and I haven't gotten a fight yet, Dr. Landrum.
Well, welcome to Season 3. And do we have a new attraction for you?
That's
I
called foreshadowing.
I mean, we can dump that script right now, and we can be full of piss and vinegar, and we can really go at it if we need to. Dr. Rob, or
Yep.
Dr. McIntarfer, if you want, or
We came close to it at the end of season 2, probably the closest we have with the "Oh, Rob" and "But Eric" exchange that we had.
probably so. And I don't, there's probably no reason for you to go back and listen. But so season 2 had 10 episodes. And what I do is I record kind of a generic intro for all 10. I'm sorry, I'm too lazy. I don't customize an intro
How dare you?
for I'm owning it right now. So there's a generic, but I did have fun talking about that and foreshadowing that. I also promote Casey's appearance and also our discussion of Albert Bandura. So I try to kind of promo some themes across the season, but I did promo the "Oh, Rob, but Eric," the Laura Petrie, but then the stern rejoinder. So
I will hear that as I march through one of my goals, and I didn't tell you this yet, but I'm going to be re-listening to episodes and writing about them because we always start such great conversations. I'm going to use my blog as a place to listen to a conversation that I had with my friend Eric and see if I still agree with myself, maybe process some of our stuff in writing with links, and then maybe put social media posts out there with the blog post and the psych sessions post.
that's not where I expected that sentence to end. I thought you were going to go with, I'm going to have my students listen to those entries because they are mentioned in a number of those
They
episodes where
are.
you're talking about your research method students. I thought I'm going to have those students listen to those, so at least we'll get a handful of downloads and listeners, and we'll boost our stats.
Yep. As we're talking, we have no idea who or if anyone will ever hear what we're saying.
Well, we'll have an idea, and it's serious business in the podcast world, but we don't At Psych Sessions International headquarters, we don't
That's in Belgium, right?
it moves around for tax
Ah,
purposes and
sure,
for tracking purposes.
sure.
It's a mobile network,
Got it,
really.
got it.
If you're familiar with squatters' rights, it kind of moves from place to place, never really paying taxes. We don't track our provider, Libsyn, does not track IP addresses. So we do know what I should take that back. They track it in a way where they can tell us the country of origin, and they may track to know what country a listener's coming from, but we never get specific listener. We don't get stats about listeners per se. We do get unique download statistics broken down by when it was downloaded, what country the download was requested from, what server it was downloaded from. And so that issue is really a hot button issue in the podcasting world.
Got
So now that we've lost 40% of our listeners, and we'll
it.
know that from the statistics we can gather, my friend, what would you like to talk about today?
Well, perhaps we picked up some listeners from Belgium just because I mentioned the word, you never know, but
Well, if that's the case, we're about to sing the international country song and mention all the countries we can lyrically in 60 seconds.
no, I the only topic that I thought of, and this might not be, I don't know, maybe it would be an uplifting topic, or it may be a bummer to start season 3 with, was mental student and maybe teacher mental health and wellness and teaching introductory psychology, just as a general topic. And I think that's a big topic that can go in a bunch of different directions. I'll tell you why I'm bringing it up, and
Okay.
that we may go off in that direction or we may not. I'm hearing from the high school where I teach. I had a conversation with one of the guidance counselors today, and then I hear from teacher and administrator friends from the other high schools in my town that student mental health is a big deal right now, and they're having some rather acute issues, more acute issues now than they typically have in other years. And in many ways, that isn't a surprise. I think I'm walking into this conversation data free, so you may know more data than I do about mental health worldwide right now in different age groups. But something about missing the fourth quarter of 2020 and high school, and then the students who came back being half-time, part-time Zoom, part-time in person last year. My high school administrator and teacher friends are saying they're seeing that maybe change student mental health for the worse at this point in the year this year.
Well, Rob, I think there's a lot going on. And in terms of positive mental health, I want to start us with this sound effect, and then I'm going to turn back to the very serious
Okay.
topic that
All right.
that you started this with. And by the way, for our listeners, that was the fine opening of a Diet Mountain Dew, and not a
Nice.
cold beer. So anyway,
Nice.
I think for both high school students who might be taking psychology, thinking about juniors and seniors in high school, as well as freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors in college taking introductory psychology or any psychology course for that matter. I think health and wellness is always an issue. Well, for anyone, but if we're talking the age range, let's just be broad and call it 16 to 26.
Mhm.
Let's be inclusive there. I think there are self-care issues, there are mental health challenges for many people in that age range under what we might have called in the olden days normal times. And I'm using air quotes for people who obviously can't see us, which is everybody. I think under pandemic conditions, I also think not only you add pandemic conditions and you add, um, the continuing turmoil and concern over Black Lives Matter, you look at stuff coming out of January 6th riots, and now we're going into a weekend where in Washington, DC, there's a planned celebration of the January 6th riot. There's a lot of good things going on in the United States, but there's a lot of troubling trends in the United States as well. So I think that if we're seeing increased levels of mental health disruptions that feels right. That data point feels right to me. And I think, quite honestly, a lot of educators, including those in psychology departments and with psychological training, don't know how to deal with that. And, I was trained as a cognitive psychologist. I'm a chair of a department of psychological science, but that doesn't mean that I'm a therapist. That doesn't mean that I know the exact signs of telling the difference between a clinical depression and when someone's bummed out. So I think in our schools, we just need to know who the resource people are and what some of the warning signs are to when to refer for help, but not to know. I don't think we have to know what to do, but when to refer for help.
Yeah, totally agree. I'm in the same boat as you. No way a counselor, never claimed to be, don't play one on TV. And that's one of the major things, one of the major takeaways we want students to come away from the psychological disorders, the whole clinical part of intro psych with. Neither are they. I just heard this morning a couple students talking about a high school psychology class, not at the high school where I teach, where the well-meaning teacher gave them all an assignment to take a celebrity and figure out where that celebrity, if that celebrity could, should, maybe be diagnosed with something from the DSM. And I know where that teacher's coming from, but I cringe inside when I hear those assignments. It might help students deeply encode characteristics of certain psychological disorders, but what it also helps them encode is you can be an armchair clinical psychologist.
Yeah, boy, Rob, I think you're exactly onto it in that if that assignment exercise ended with, see what we just did? We just did something that no one should ever do.
Yeah.
If that were the demo, I think that would be fine. I remember, and I think everyone remembers when Donald Trump was president and people started to do this with him. They tried to diagnose or they tried to think about if he has a personality disorder, what might he have and what axis would he be on and things like that. And regardless of what you think of him and regardless of the person, unless you have the skills and the training and the access to the client, it's not a good practice. And it's certainly not an ethical practice for a licensed psychologist to do that. Maybe in certain search situations with a client, you might do it with telemedicine. You might not be in the presence physically, but you might have, a 2 or 3 hour appointment with a person over Zoom or in a telehealth or telemedicine situation, but no one would do a legitimate diagnosis of someone over Facebook images or statements made in the newspaper. That would be for entertainment purposes only. That would be as a cartoon. No matter if you're and I'm no matter if you're a Republican, Democrat, or independent, no matter if you love or hate the person being scrutinized, it's just not an ethical practice. So you're right. I see too, it'd be better to do hypothetical people that the person has made up, but then also talk about the things that you and I just talked about.
Yeah, Jane Hallinan has a neat activity. It's been around for a long time with fairy tale characters and sample therapist client interviews with fairy tale characters. And that's much better. And it makes me wonder, as teachers, we kind of, or some of us call each other out on some of these things. I've had other teachers gently call me out on some things that I've done in class that maybe might not have been the best idea. And I just called this anonymous teacher out on the assignment that she gave her about celebrities and diagnoses. Sometimes when we hear about things like Donald Trump and personality disorders in the news, it's being promoted, perpetrated by clinical psychologists. Not all the time, but sometimes they're interviewing a person with a degree, a person who is qualified to do that kind of diagnosis, and they somehow think that's okay. And I wonder if there's processes within the clinical community where they call each other out for that sort of thing.
I'm sure that there are. I'm sure that there are sanctions that a licensed psychologist could be, subjected to because, the licensure, and it varies from state to state, but the licensure, that's a rigorous process. I mean, in some states, again, I can't speak nationally because there is no national standard, but in some states it's a 3,000 hours of clinical supervision and taking the EPPP, a national exam. And those criteria sometimes are transferable from state to state. Some states have reciprocity, but others don't. And so for someone who's licensed to go on an NPR or a local TV station and to do that, either they're not practicing or they're just being cavalier with their professional credentials. And while it might be titillating to do that and entertaining, and you might think the majority of people agree with you, it's still not good role modeling of what our discipline has to offer,
Yeah.
and puts us all at risk of, "Oh, look how armchair quarterback, they don't even have to see the person." Well, if they can do that to Joe Biden or Donald Trump, well, I don't even have to go see a psychologist if they can do me from a mile away, why bother go seeing one?
Yep. It also contributes to the really annoying thing that we all experience when you tell someone that you teach psychology, they back up and they jokingly say, "Oh, I better be careful around you," which gets super annoying after the second time that it happens. And it contributes to that tendency, I think.
Yeah, but I think, I think every profession probably
Yeah.
has those stereotypes, and it is annoying, but at the same time, I think, at least for me, there are worse things I could be annoyed by, and my normal comeback is, "Yes, you're right, and now you owe me 150 bucks."
Nice.
And that normally kind of breaks that ice, and
Nice.
but that is not an approach for everyone, and, all kinds of professions have stereotypes, and,
Yeah.
I think college professor, at least for me, has always carried a positive halo effect. It's a positive stereotype for the most part when I'm introduced to people who don't know me, who've never met me. It's positive most of the time.
Totally agree. Same thing with high school teacher.
Yeah, yeah, teaching for the most part is, I think, perceived as a noble profession
Yep.
and an honorable one, and at least I think I can speak for you here, rightly so
Yeah.
most of the
Yep.
time.
This might be a stretch, but w- as teachers, scholars, people who are interested in psychology, we know that there are some practices that are completely out of bounds. So, say a psychological researcher, a psychology teacher has a pet theory. And what we do is we go out and we find one anecdote about one person and it fits our pet theory and we present that as support for our pet theory, right?
Okay.
We teach high school and introductory psychology students that data are not the plural of anecdote, that an anecdote is a useful maybe way to start your thinking, but if you actually want support, support looks like this. Here are standards for what evidence is, empirical evidence is. It's I think that cherry picking a few episodes from a famous person's life and diagnosing them with something is kinda similar. Does that seem like a stretch?
No, I don't think it's a stretch. I'm not sure they're parallel.
Okay.
So I don't know if that's what you mean by stretch.
Yeah, probably.
I think, I am not enough of a diagnostician to probably understand that. I know that in many
Yeah, me either.
times in the DSM, something will have multiple criteria and it has to be, you have to experience 6 out of 9 or 6 out of 12, and these things have to happen within the past 6 months kind of thing. And so there are criteria that have to be met, and there's a threshold that has to be satisfied before a labeling occurs, and that labeling is oftentimes very powerful. Um, I do think that there are some famous theories in the past in psychology that started as a series of anecdotes or just as stuff that people made up and
Yeah,
called a theory. But then maybe other people came along later and verified with data.
yeah,
And the 2 that pop into my mind the most, well, probably the most common one that's known about is Sigmund Freud. So
yeah,
Sigmund Freud, thought of himself as a researcher from what I've read, and generated a lot of theories about human behavior. and was undoubtedly a large influence in the psychological development and ideas, but collected very little data other than the patients that he saw, and invented things like id, ego, and superego, and state psychosexual stages of development, and things like that, and defense mechanisms, and but had very little data. But other people came after him and found evidence that supported, for example, defense mechanisms, but he didn't have any data for it per se. He might have had his own life experiences that he described and then put a label on it, or experiences with his mother and his father that he put a label on. But that was his data. Data are more than anecdotes, like you said. So that's so sometimes that's how our theories get formed, which really kind of aren't theories, but someone can call it a theory.
Right, it's kind of an intuitive model that ends up having some empirical support later on, but the model came out of judgment, intuition, something like that.
It came out of the ether, but he
Yeah,
had the gravitas at the time to state it and make
right.
it sound like fact, and then someone else came along, and others actually more than one someone else came along, and some things got debunked, but are still taught, but we just qualify them and debunk them, but other things, other people came along to try to verify or debunked, and they got supported,
Yeah.
which is kind of the best of science, right? Either
Mhm.
we go out and we find data. The other one that I know of is self-actualization from Maslow's
Mm,
hierarchy of needs. The story that I can remember reading about is that it's not that Maslow kind of did a factor analysis and figured out that that was the fifth and top level. What I understand from his research is that he knew people. He knew about 12 people that he thought had were at the pinnacle, and he interviewed them, and then he invented this top level of human existence called self-actualization, and that's where he invented it in his head.
yeah,
That's in the hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is the cat's meow, and
right.
he got it from about 12 people that he knew.
Yeah,
And I'm not as familiar with the data that supports, the other 4 stages that lead to that. I don't know about that or not. But I do know that he just, divined it, so to speak.
right. It reminds me a great conversation with my research methods students about falsifiability the other day, and they really have latched onto that as an interesting principle, kind of a litmus test to use when, they're examining claims. And falsifiability applies in interesting ways, I think, to both examples you brought up. I know, some people have used Freud's intuitive ideas to generate testable hypotheses,
Yeah,
and
yes,
sometimes they've been falsifiable, and sometimes
yes,
they haven't.
that's right.
Sometimes they've been supported. Maslow, I wonder if it applies in a different way. I don't even know what falsifiable evidence would be about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Well, you'd have to write a hypothesis that you could either
Uh-huh.
support or refute, but, it'd kinda be like stages. I mean, like
Yeah,
Erickson's level of stages, there's a pivot point, there's 2, what is it? I'm gonna get them wrong, and developmentalists,
sure.
are gonna be screaming at the speaker, right? Isolation versus despair,
Right,
and I would imagine developmental scientist has figured out a way to test when a person is at such age level, whether or not their behavior demonstrates, isolation or despair. Again, I'm probably not getting that pairing right,
right,
or, whatever the Ericksonian stage is. Well,
right.
is someone in that literature probably, has someone figured out what is it? What's the man? I don't and I'm not gonna Google it because 'cause I'm not
So
gonna
there's
cheat.
generativity versus stagnation.
No, I'm sorry. What's the
Oh,
stage in Maslow below, self-actualization?
oh, shoot. So
There's
it goes
belongingness,
belongingness and love needs,
physiological is there at the bottom.
physiological to the bottom. Shoot, we should know this. We've seen this diagram a bunch of different times, Dr. Landrum.
Physiological belongingness,
Uh-huh.
safety, food and
R
safety.
right. So I think yeah.
I know I've seen the modified one that has Wi-Fi, right? But
Right.
but,
I think it might be belongingness and love that's below self-actualization, but I could be wrong.
yeah, so, I mean, I would imagine a clever psychological scientist has operationally defined those, and there's probably a clever operational definition of self-actualization that some motivation and emotion researcher has developed out there that I don't know about because I don't ever teach the motivation and emotion chapter in intro psych, which is why I'm in the blind on that one. But, yeah, I think I think those are interesting things to tackle, and it's all about those definitions and measuring and metrics, and you're right, the falsification, I mean, boy, if your students are capturing that in high school, good for you, man.
Falsifiability.
That
It's and I'll have to see later on how well it stuck. I'll have some sort of writing assignment and look for it to pop up and see whether it does or not.
that
But
yeah, that notion of, you know, we can't prove what didn't happen. We can, you know, we don't prove things in psychology. We only disprove things. It takes students a while to wrap their head around that. It takes
oh,
students a oh, go ahead. Yeah.
no, you go.
No, it takes when I teach research methods, it just takes them a while. And honestly, I don't even think some of my students in my own my 300 level research methods class actually really wrap their head around. We don't ever prove anything in psychology. We only disprove things. We don't prove a hypothesis to be true. We only disprove hypotheses that cannot be true, so
Right.
that the only thing left standing is the alternative hypothesis,
Yeah.
you know?
And it's a stretch to call this a demonstration, but I think I got the idea from Ken Keith, falsifiability and helping students understand the principle of falsifiability. And I did this in my research methods class and it worked pretty well, although it's quite annoying to them. You say something like, right here underneath the podium, haven't told you all yet, but there's a leprechaun right here underneath this. So telling you there's a leprechaun right here, that's fine. Do you believe me? And they say no. Okay, so what questions do you have? And then every question you basically dodge as non-falsifiable. So a student says, "Can I come see it?" "Oh, no, sorry. It's an invisible leprechaun. Forgot to tell you." "Can I come grab the leprechaun?" "Nope, nope, nope. Matter passes through this leprechaun. Sorry. Nope." "What color is it?" "It's a green leprechaun." "Can I come see it?" "No, nope. Sorry. Remember, it's invisible." "Can I talk to the leprechaun?" "Nope, only talks to me." So using that as an example of, well, if there's no way for me to prove the existence of that thing, then it's a non-falsifiable concept,
Right.
and we can probably just stop talking about it in science.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. And, I used to give a lecture about what is good characteristics of good science.
Mhm.
And one of the characteristics is that it only can look at testable, falsifiable hypotheses.
Yeah.
Does life on Venus exist? That might be a really interesting question. It's not a good scientific question because we
Right.
don't have a way to falsify that yet. We
Right.
can't get to Venus and test a hypothesis that either says yes, there is life or no, there isn't life.
Yeah.
Maybe the most important question of all time is not a good hypothesis. And maybe this is too deep. And we might have to edit this part out. But maybe the most important question of all time is not a good scientific hypothesis. Does God exist?
Yeah.
Is I don't know how to test that hypothesis
Right.
scientifically, where you can produce evidence to scientific standards that can either refute or support God's existence.
Our conversation about falsifiability actually went in a pretty similar place. We talked about empirical evidence and versus non-empirical evidence earlier on. So students kind of established that there's a world of the empirical. There are empirical questions and there are non-empirical questions. And one of the examples that came up with non-empirical questions, non-falsifiable questions, is religious faith.
Yeah.
And they were able to handle the idea, is there any evidence? And I asked them to think about this question, not answer it. Those of you who believe in God, is there any empirical evidence that could happen that would destroy your belief? And most of them said, nope, can't imagine any
Yeah.
evidence that would destroy my belief in God. So that's fantastic. It means it's a non-empirical thing. That means we're in a realm other than science, and we're not going to try to prove or disprove that empirically. That's a different way of looking at the world.
Right. I mean, and people have said oftentimes, I mean, more eloquently than I'm about to say it, that faith is the idea of believing in something when there is a lack of evidence.
Right.
That's what faith is. And
Right.
and a person can be have faith in God and believe in God and be a hardcore scientist at the same time. You don't have to
Absolutely.
apply the same standards Monday through Friday that you do on Saturday or Sunday. Uh,
Yeah, we talked about there are different ways to try to figure the world out, and the empirical scientific route is an incredibly powerful and important way, but there are other ways to try to figure the world out, and not just faith-based ways.
yeah,
Poets, well, the aforementioned Ken Keith. One of the ways Ken tries to figure the world out besides science is also through writing poetry.
yeah.
And I don't think he doesn't apply the same standards in that lens when he's trying to establish truth through poetry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole thing in scientific epistemology about ways of knowing, and
Yeah,
scientific a scientific approach is only one of many ways of knowing. And
yeah.
not to get too serious with you, but if and you don't have to share your perspective if you don't want to, but if you look at the complexity of the brain and the human body, um, at least for me, it's kind of hard to not imagine God or some godlike structure, some deity type being not being involved there. Because it's hard for me to imagine random chance over time, over millennia, where that is just randomly involved into who we are now. That it and and I'm sure evolutionary psychologists would be screaming at me with, "That's exactly what it was." And okay, Marty, 1.2 gigawatts, whatever. But to me, I think you can hold both beliefs at the same time. I think
Sure.
you can be godly and believe in faith and believe in religion and be a psychological scientist and require data and facts to draw conclusions.
Yeah, I really enjoy reading. I don't share his faith, but I really enjoy reading Dave Myers's. I've read parts of his books about how he combines his Christian faith and a deep knowledge of psychological principles. And I think the argument that you just echoed, I think is a famous. I think it's called the Watchmaker's argument or something like that. And I
Oh,
forget
very
who
cool.
did it. The argument went, you couldn't throw a bunch of parts of a watch into a windstorm and expect a pocket watch to come out. I think was that argument. I'm on the evolution side of it,
Of
that
course.
I just marvel at the ways that the simple, rather relatively simple principles of survival advantage and selective adaptation did produce the brain, even though I cannot comprehend how it happened.
Yeah,
Goodness
but
gracious.
I believe in those too. I don't
Yeah.
rule out the survival of the fittest and, selective adaptation
Yeah.
and all of that over time. I think they can be things that happen together, but,
Yeah.
how did it all start? And
Yeah.
I think there can be interactions and synergisms between the two. And the other thing that I think helps, me not get in trouble is that I'm not gonna try to convince you of
Oh, right.
anything that I
Right.
believe, and I'm not trying to influence you or sell you anything or get you to vote a certain way. I am very much live and let live, and
Absolutely.
I'm not even quite sure exactly if I know precisely what I believe, and I could even articulate it. I and if I was to ever listen back to this, it probably doesn't make any sense at all. So, and I'm okay with that. Hopefully, our listeners will at least listen through and be okay with it too.
Yeah, and I and that the ways of knowing concept that you brought up earlier, I've found that really useful in my discussions with other people. And this is totally in my bag because or in my area because the other high school course I used to teach is philosophy.
Oh, awesome.
So I loved talking
Yeah,
about this stuff with high school students.
yeah.
And one of the things that was really useful for those students is when we talked specifically about those different ways of knowing, when you're talking with someone about something, a conclusion, a claim that they have, if you know what way of knowing they're using, you can have a much more useful discussion. If it's an empirical claim, then you can have a much more useful discussion about evidence and what the evidence says. If you know it's a non-empirical claim, if you know it's a faith-based claim, don't try and argue, don't try to bash the person with empirical evidence because it's just a futile. You're missing each other. You won't be talking to each other, you'll be talking past each other.
Yeah, and I think that's probably maybe the heart of what's going on so much in
Oh,
2021 and the
yes.
discord of and I think the terms do matter, so I wanna be careful.
Mhm.
You know, I was gonna say Republicans and Democrats, but it's really more complicated than that. It's probably more conservatives and liberals, and it's probably more complicated than that, red state, blue state.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I even have the right labels for it, but, where people are getting their evidence and what they're concentrating on. I'll just give you one data point that I heard last night on TV. In April of this year, 2021, this was a poll done of Republicans. 70% thought that Donald Trump had won the 2020 election.
Yeah.
In September of 2021, another sample of Republicans were asked. 78% of Republicans had won the election. So over the summer, the idea had grown amongst Republicans that Donald Trump had won the 2020 election, and that's what they believe. So it doesn't make any sense for me to go around saying, "Well, they're dumb or they're
Right.
wrong." They believe what they believe. So as a psychological scientist, the fascinating issue becomes, well, how is that happening and what impact it does that have on our society, on legislation, on getting things done, on how we live day to day, on future conflicts, because that seems unprecedented in human history, or I'm sorry, in US history, that after an election, this far after an election, there's growing disagreement about the outcome of an election. So, ways of thinking really can matter dramatically.
Absolutely, and we have historian friends who might know of other points in even in US history where similar things happened, and historians have their own ways of knowing and figuring that out.
Yeah, I think there was an election in the 1800s where there was some debate afterwards for a few months about
Yeah,
the outcomes of it, but I think from my recollection of hearing about it on the news, that was more due to slowness of counting ballots and
probably.
distributing news around the country. It wasn't the same level of distrust in the system as I think
Right.
what some people have today. So,
This is kind of jumping clear back, but I think it's relevant to our current discussion too. I liked the examples that you gave of psychological models that started in an intuitive way and then ended up maybe being tested empirically and maybe not. Another one that I think is really interesting is the Myers-Briggs personality test connected to the Jungian idea. So I think I'm safe. I'm no
yeah.
Jungian scholar, but I think I'm safe saying that those ideas, the Jungian archetypes of personality, started as a fairly intuitive model. I think we can put that in with Freud and the psychodynamic perspective, and Jung came up with and wrote a lot about eloquently these different archetypal aspects of personality. And what I think I know about the Myers-Briggs test is that idea was picked up by two folks. I think it was a mother and a daughter team
That's correct.
who wrote an inventory. And I'm not even sure if it ever got Jung's stamp of approval or not. I think they tried to write to him, but I'm not sure
Hmm.
if it was ever really integrated into Jungian scholarship at all or not. But goodness, did it take off, right? The
Yes.
the interesting thing about it to me is I think it persists because it's so intuitively compelling, even though there's pretty good empirical evidence that the categories don't hold up. So the intuitive appeal is overwhelming the empirical evidence.
Well, so I think I would have a slightly different spin on it. I'm not gonna disagree with you, but I would spin it a little bit differently. I think I think there's very good evidence of the psychometric properties of the scale. I think where there's fault has been found is that when people have taken the scale scores and they have been obnoxious with it. So
Okay.
if you just give someone the Myers-Briggs type inventory and you give them their four-letter combination, they're an EFTJ or an INFP or whatever, and you read the descriptions and you have them reflect on their preferences in the world, I think you're pretty good. It's when you start saying, "Well, an INFP, you're not gonna be good at that sales job," or an EFTJ, "You should apply for that promotion to mid-level manager at Google because we've got data that shows." I think that's where, the criticisms of the Myers-Briggs other people came along and started using it for hiring, for promotions, for training, selection into training programs. I think other people came along and kind of bastardized the use of the instrument. I think the psychometrics of it initially were solid. I mean, tens of thousands of people took it, and I think the validity and reliability of the initial instrument, if you use it for insight about yourself, I'm pretty confident it's a good instrument. Beyond that, people started to use it for business purposes, for purposes of which it was never intended to be
Got
used.
it. And I may need to go back and read the critique because what you're saying makes sense that validity is an aspect of score use. And if people are using the scores in ways that they weren't intended to be, then there wouldn't be any predictive validity. And that's not necessarily a problem with the scale. That's a problem with score use.
Yeah.
I thought there were also some problems, but I'll need to go back and read with discriminative validity where the categories actually weren't holding well, that you might be in a category uh, and that category can't statistically really be distinguished from another
Well,
category.
and I think the authors were so I actually there was a time in my life where I actually would occasionally go and do a workshop and give it. I would
Ah.
give it to participants and then we'd talk about it, but then we would move on to talk about other things.
Hmm.
And I think if I'm remembering the materials correctly, they're pretty fair about the scoring. So let's say that you're taking the first one is E versus I, introversion,
Right.
extroversion. And if your score is 17 and 2, um, on the 2 on E and I, and it's 17 introversion, 2 extroversion, you're pretty heavily leaning introversion. And
Mhm.
so but they talk about being on the cusp. So
Right.
if you're 8-7, then they're gonna warn you, "Okay, you might have 8 on E and 7 on I, but don't get carried away with that
Right.
because you're really, ambivalent. You're leaning both ways." And again, it's really all about I mean, if you really read their stuff, it's about preferences. It's
Mhm.
not that you're introverted or extroverted, for example. It's just that that's your preference in the world.
Mhm.
Um, the analogy that I always used was handedness. I'm right-handed, but if I broke my right hand, I could learn to write with my left hand. It wouldn't be my preference, but
Sure.
I could learn to write with it. So if you don't take the ball and run with it and be obnoxious with it about hiring and firing, I think it can be useful. But if you use it for self-reflection and, "Oh, this is the way I look at the world. Oh, when I go to a conference, that's why I go to a couple sessions and then I have to go to my hotel room and just have some quiet time because I am an introvert, and, oh, that's why Regan does go to 14 sessions, and he goes to dinner, and then he goes for drinks. He's an extrovert, and he gets excited by being around other people. He gets energized by being around all those people. Oh, he is extroverted." That there is some intuitive it makes sense.
Right.
Um, when you start
I'm excited to go I'm excited to go look at research about it now to figure out the psychometric what researchers say about the psychometric properties of the test itself versus how this test scores are used.
Yeah. And the other thing, Rob, that you commented on that I want to react to is that I think in many ways, all new let me qualify that. I think many new ideas or new theories do come out of someone's head with no support. And they go into the lab or they go into the environment and they start collecting data. I think the difference in 2021 is that we don't just declare them a theory and then go and support them like a Maslow did or like a Freud did.
Hmm.
We have this hypothesis about imposter phenomenon, and then we go in the lab and we do some work on it. And then if it works out, we publish it. But if it doesn't work out, we never publish it.
Mm,
So I think all new ideas, brand new ideas, which are really rare, start in someone's head without any support probably, or an offshoot of some older idea. And that's where they come from. We just don't make the declaration. Um,
right.
like,
Our our conjecture is more less published or less popularly published, maybe.
yeah, because we don't, in fact, maybe that's exactly what, the replication crisis was all about. And and what is it, registration, the process of
Yeah.
registering your study, making
Right.
the declaration public. And here's what I hope to find. And here's how I'm going to test, whereas you're not p hacking and making all those types
Yeah.
of errors. I think that's meant to correct that and say,
Yeah.
here's what I'm doing.
I love I that's an idea for another conversation. As intro psych teachers, what do we teach students about the replication crisis and possible ways to combat the replication crisis? Kind of what do intro psych students need to know about that? Because it gets complicated fast.
I think there's some people we could invite to that. My quick answer is I'm not so sure they need to know anything.
Yeah, but
Intro
that might be
psych
a fun
stu
conversation.
I'm
Yeah.
not so sure research method students need to know much about it. I think they have to understand
Yeah.
the basics before they understand the nuances,
Yeah.
but I actually
Right.
know people around the country who disagree with me on that.
Right. Right. Yeah.
2 people that come to my mind right away talking about that, John Gray and Beth
Okay.
Moreland. So, it
Okay.
might be fun to have a guest.
Yeah. I think Elliot Hammer might have some
Oh,
things to say
it'd
about
be
that too.
fun to have him too. So
Yeah.
so we could maybe hit in season 3, we could have a few guests with us.
I like it.
Yeah. Well, Rob, thanks for hanging in there with me.
This was
I
fantastic.
I hope you didn't have any pressing concerns over this hour. I hope you didn't have to go. I hope you were able to be with me and that you were comfortable the entire time.
Absolutely. This room was very restful. Thank you.
Good. Good. I want you to be able to rest and relax and be comfortable. Anything that's pressing inside can be a discomfort and can be distracting.
Yep.
Be sure
Absolutely.
to watch your P's and Q's as always.
Will do. Will do.
All right.
I'll keep the barn door closed.
Yes, absolutely. Like a good Midwestern person would, my friend. Thank you, buddy.
It was great. Thanks.
Thanks.